أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح ببركة الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد أما بعد فقد قال الله الحكيم في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وقل ربي زدني علما آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. There was a profound scholar by the name of Ibn Tufail, Sunni scholar. He lived about 900 years ago. Ibn Tufail, they say he was a polymath, meaning he was a master in many different sciences, amongst it theology, philosophy, astronomer. He was an astrologer, he was a mathematician, and he specialized in medicine as well. So he was a polymath, he was someone who mastered many different fields. And this was quite common if you look at, for example, the history of Islam from a holistic perspective. They say he wrote a book, and the name of the book is Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. And the translation literally is alive, son of awake. Or the one who is alive, son of the one who is awake. Hayy ibn Yaqdhan. The premise of this book, it's remarkable, it's a very interesting book because from an academic perspective, from an educational perspective, a pedagogical perspective, it was one of the earliest books where Ibn Tufail was able to understand all of the complex philosophical aspects that were discussed in his time, and for him to then translate it as a story to present to the layperson. So Hayy ibn Yaqdhan is a novel, an Islamic novel, where he talks about a person who was raised in an island, isolated from the rest of humanity. You know, we have the Jungle Book, Mowgli. Yes, he was raised amongst the animals. It's the same principle, but this was predated 900 years ago. So it's much, much older. He says that there was this child, an infant, who was raised in an island. And as he was raised by an antelope. The antelope was his mother. So as he was raised by the antelope or the deer would look after him, provide food, milk, and so on and so forth. As he grew up and matured, he would then, for example, communicate with the birds and the different types of animals he was surrounded with. He would communicate with the fishes. As he matured even more, he would then observe the existence that's around him. So he would observe the trees, he would observe the water, he would observe the behavior of the animals, he would observe the skies, and he would then study the stars. So as he matured, naturally, he was differentiated and much more distinguished in comparison to the animals that he was raised with. Now, Ibn Tufail was making a very powerful argument here, that if a human being alone is raised, isolated from the rest of humanity, fitratan, he would recognize that there is a creator. So the claim that Ibn Tufail was now proposing through this novel was that this person who is isolated and alienated from the rest of the world, when he observed the existence that he was surrounded with, he recognized that there is a greater power who has designed everything. So that was the conclusion of this book. And of course, at the age of 30, he meets the first human being. Then he goes into society. When he goes into society, he then has interactions with the people around him. At the age of 49, then he begins to spread and is ready to impart knowledge to the people around him from what he's learned, from the wisdom that he's acquired. So this is a very Very, very powerful argument that is unanimously agreed. If you look at the essence of the religion of Islam, the message that it proposes is that the human being, if he is not impacted from his external environment, then naturally he will be nurtured to follow Allah, recognize Allah, and of course turn to Him in obedience. This is the fitrah of the human being, when it is not infiltrated by anything from the external environment. As human beings, because we live in a society, you realize that by communicating with people of different backgrounds, Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. People with different backgrounds and different ideologies and different concepts and different cultures and languages, you realize that it is very, very possible for us to have doubts within what we believe in. We've been taught one thing, but when we interact with the wider society, it's very easy for a doubt to enter our hearts. How we react and how we treat that doubt is the center of our discussion tonight, inshallah. You see, having doubt can be a good thing. Majority of the time it's a good thing because it's a platform, it's a catalyst for us to develop our faith and to become stronger. But sometimes it can overwhelm us and it can move us away from the religion of Islam or lose trust in the religion of Islam. Now, it's not as easy as saying that this is what one should do when a doubt occurs, because it's much more sophisticated. The discussion is much more sophisticated. When you look at Nabi Allah Ibrahim alayhi salam, they say that one day as he's walking, he sees a mayyit on the road. When he sees the mayyit, there's a thought that enters his mind. He says, how will Allah resurrect this particular mayyit? The ayah of the Holy Quran says, وَإِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمَ رَبِّي أَرِنِي كَيْفَ تُحْيِي الْمَوْتَى. Show me how you will revive the dead. Allah's response is very interesting. He says, Ibrahim, أَوَلَمْ تُؤْمِنْ? Do you not believe? He says, no, the belief is there. The iman is there. But there is always this curiosity to increase one's level of yaqeen. He says, I have yaqeen. I don't doubt the power that you have to resurrect the dead, but the processes of how it's done, that's a very interesting aspect that I'm interested in understanding. So even someone like Nabi Allah Ibrahim alayhi salam, he has this curiosity to learn more about his religion, to learn more about the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, within our lives as normal human beings, you find that we have a sense of curiosity, maybe perhaps a doubt will come towards our way, and we want to kind of relinquish ourselves from this doubt, to try and understand what exactly the Islamic position is in many different areas and dimensions of our lives. So with regards to this, you find that the scholars came forward and they said that there are three levels of the human being. There is a level of the human being where the person recognizes himself to be a Muslim. He has knowledge, but his knowledge is very, very much superficial. When a doubt comes towards him, when a shubha, a doubt comes towards him, you find that he becomes very shaky and he's willing to compromise or even leave the religion of Islam. The knowledge that he has is not strong enough for him to protect himself from the doubts that come towards him. So the religion of Islam is not just about learning and memorizing and gathering or acquiring information and storing that information somewhere in ourselves. It's a bit more than that. It has to be experiential. Once knowledge is given to us, then we have to put it into practice. We need to invest our time, we need to invest our energy to mold ourselves according to what we know. When a person practices what he knows, then he reaches the second level, which is known as al-iman. This person has faith. He practices what he knows. He lives his life according to the Muslim Islamic values. Then when a shubha or a doubt approaches him, he is able to counteract it. It shakes his faith, but not significantly. So he goes out, he learns, he asks the ulama, he gains knowledge, and so on and so forth, and he's able to overcome these doubts. The third level is the level of yaqeen. Yaqeen meaning that whenever a doubt comes towards a person, he is absolutely certain with regards to his beliefs. It doesn't move him in any way whatsoever. Regardless of how powerful the doubt may be, because he is well grounded in his faith, he does not move from his position. Al-istiqama. We recite this in Surah Al-Fatiha, yes? Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Guide us on the path which is very much established, not the right path, the path which is established, grounded. Give me istiqama, that I too am grounded. Whereas if the entire world was to shake, I am standing firm. And when a person stands firm in such a way, you find that other people will collect towards him to seek support. That's the meaning of istiqamah. That's the meaning of Sirat al-Mustaqim. They say a man by the name of Abu Hashim al-Ja'fari came towards Imam al-Hadi alayhi salatu wassalam. And the moment he left his house, he was very much agitated. You know, sometimes we reach a point in our lives when we want to complain. We want to open our hearts to someone. We don't want anyone to give us solutions. We just want them to listen to us. We want to complain. That was his attitude. He left his house. He was suffering from a number of different problems. Majority of it, the predominant one was poverty. So there was something happened. Someone took some of his money away and he wanted to complain. So he came towards the Imam. And throughout the journey, as he's walking to the house of the Imam, he's thinking about what to say to the Imam. The moment he meets the Imam alayhi salam, the Imam looks towards him and he says, Ya Aba Hashim, for which blessing have you come to me to mention about? Like, which blessing has Allah given you for you to come to me and to tell me about this particular blessing? So Abu Hashim is now thrown aback. He loses his balance a little bit. He's like, hold on a second. I didn't come here to mention the blessings that Allah has given me. I've come to mention some of the difficulties that I'm going through. But the perspective that the Imam approached is very, very interesting. That in times of trials and tribulations, Ya Abu Hashim, think about the good that Allah has given you rather than the bad that you've lost. So anyways, in the course of the discussion, the hadith mentions, it says, Ya Abu Hashim, let me highlight something for you. You say that you're poor, that you're indigent, and you are in need. What if someone was to come towards you and tell you that I'll give you 100 dinars, release yourself from the faith, denounce the Ahlul-bayt? So Abu Hashim says, no, I wouldn't do that. He says, what about 1,000 dinars? He says, I wouldn't do that. He says, what about 10,000 dinars? He says, no. 100,000 dinars, 1,000,000 dinars. The Imam keeps increasing the number. It says, Yabna Rasulullah, there are boundaries. When it comes to faith, when it comes to belief, there are boundaries. And I'm not willing to sacrifice this. It says, Ya Aba Hashim, do you not recognize that you have an asset within your hands that is worth all of the jewels and the money of the world? And yet you call yourself a poor man? Now that's a very interesting insight or approach that the Imam alayhi salam is establishing. That many a times when we call and identify ourselves as Muslims, there's something so valuable in our hands, but we don't recognize it. Until and unless we go and study what's there within our hearts, we don't recognize how powerful and valuable this Islam is. So, as we communicate with society, we face different types of doubts. There are two major types of doubts, and our approach to these doubts are very different. So the first type of doubts, which are considered to be insignificant, and I'll explain what this means, insignificant doubts. Our attitude towards these insignificant doubts is that we should ignore them. But then you have the other category, which doubts may appear as significant, but then there are different solutions depending on the type of the doubt. So with regards to the first, you'll find that many a times within our lives, we have this thing to constantly doubt or question. And it may appear as something significant, but in the root or in the reality of it is insignificant. You know how some individuals have OCD? That's the behavior of a person who has OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. It's not normal, it's not natural. When we observe them, we say that this person is suffering from something, isn't it? This is part of the conventional language. Whether, when it comes to wudu, for example, it takes him a very long time to perform wudu. When it comes to ghusl, likewise, it takes him a very long time to perform ghusl or cleaning or whatever it is. This behavior is not natural. So in the same way, in the same principle, you find people, when it comes to certain aspects of Islam, reality, with regards to the truth, obsessively and compulsively, they ask questions. Our attitude towards this is that we should ignore such questions. You'll find, for example, you'll come across a person, he'll ask a very innocent question. How do I know that God exists? And this has been cases, if you research in certain case studies amongst the scholars, they've come across individuals like this many a times. The person will ask, how do I know that God exists? They know the rationality or the rational proofs as to why God exists. They know all the arguments. Objective morality, for example, the cosmology example, theory, and so on and so forth. When they look at the design argument, they know all the different arguments and the rational proofs to prove the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even though you have knowledge that is there presented within the Quran, within the ahadith, that which has been expanded by the scholars, there is still that doubt that's there within the mind. How do I know that God exists? I've just witnessed a child die. Where is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You know that He exists. Intellectually, you know He exists. But then these doubts, these thoughts appear within the mind. What happens in this scenario? It is the responsibility of the person to ignore them. Within our fiqh, for example, in the fiqh discussion, if a person has kathir al-shak, a person who has constant doubts, what's his responsibility? His responsibility is to ignore them. Why ignore them? They say because one of the tools that shaitan uses to dissuade people away from religion is through shak. When you look at, for example, fiqh, a person who's constantly performing and redoing his wudu, it takes him longer than needed. What's happening here is that if he continues with this behavior, I know it's easier said than done. It's very, very difficult for a person to just switch this, to flip the switch and behave in the opposite or in a different manner altogether. But the philosophy is very interesting. If a person is constantly performing his wudu and it takes him a long time to perform his wudu, to pray his salah, the act of salah in itself, which is meant to be easy, becomes very, very difficult. And for him to maintain that 5 times a day, every single day, naturally salah, which is an easy act, becomes heavy. So there is this taste that is created towards salah, and naturally he moves away from it. Waswasa to shaitan is not something that should be belittled. Yes, waswasa to shaitan is an actual reality which is highlighted within the Holy Quran. With regards to fiqh, this is how shaitan works. He makes certain acts which are easy, very heavy for us. Then you have within our aqeedah likewise. Shaitan will come and implant a thought within our minds. الَّذِي يُوَسْوِسُ فِي صُدُورٍ nas. He communicates with the human being, but not on a physical level. He manipulates the thought of the human being. A doubt emerges. It's a very simple doubt. But the person knows the answers, but yet he still asks. The asking carries no weight in this regards. Why? Because he knows the answers. The doubt is just there, regardless of all the rational proofs you give him and evidential proofs you give him, it will not subsist that doubt. That doubt will not be removed. So it is the individual responsibility of the person to then ignore it. We behave like this in society. The way we behave with other people is the same principle. If you come across a person who lacks common sense, for example, who has no knowledge in certain areas, would you engage in a discussion with them? Let's say someone in the street, for example, you're talking to them. You know that they're wrong. You know that they lack knowledge. Let's say, for example, you specialize in engineering. And they're talking about whatever it is engineers talk about. And you know that he's wrong. You know that his arguments are fallacious in nature. Are you going to stand there and continue the discussions with him? Or continue having that discussion with him? The ayah of the Holy Quran says, وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ. When you engage and you speak and you communicate with a jahil, what do? What's your responsibility? قَالُوا salama. Cut the discussion off. Don't waste your time. There are boundaries. Set those boundaries. Say salamun alaykum and walk away. Because you know that by continuing having a discussion with them is not going to benefit you, nor is it going to benefit them. You have to ignore certain social communications, especially when you're communicating with a jahil. Based on the same principle, there are certain thoughts when it appears within the mind, it has to be ignored. If it is not left ignored, it begins to grow. And when it grows, it affects the heart of the human being. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So there is a very strong need, there is an absolute necessity for us to be aware of what type of a doubt we're dealing with, whether we know what the answers are, and how we can react accordingly. The second type of doubt is much more important, and they can be manifested in a number of different ways. These doubts, they appear to us, and the nature of these doubts are different. So for example, sometimes we'll have doubts which are based on intelligence. The doubt itself is an intellectual doubt, or sometimes it's a moral doubt, or sometimes it's a spiritual doubt, sometimes it's a social doubt, sometimes it's a doubt which is stemmed from egocentrism. It's based on one's arrogance. Is it easy to say that if a person has doubt, refer to the ulama or read books and gain knowledge to overpower those doubts? No, because the nature of all of these doubts are different, and the source of it is different, the solution therefore has to be different. With regards to the first one, intellectual doubts. A person who has an intellectual doubts, usually you see this when there is a discussion between Islam and science. And this has exacerbated much more within the past 20 years or so. You'll find that there are many Muslims, when they heard about, for example, the God particle. Yes, the God particle, it was a big thing a few years ago, that the God particle gene has been found. Found that some Muslims, they came and they said that we feel shaky now. Why? The God particle gene, if you read about it, it's got nothing to do with theology. It's got nothing to do whether God exists or not. It's just with regards to one particular area of the human body that has no relationships with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it shook the foundations of the faith of certain Muslims. When you look at the concept of evolution, evolution was a big thing about 10 years ago. When these bestseller books were now being published and sold, you found that this idea was now being propounded, it was now being expanded. So now people started asking questions, well, hold on a second, the Quran tells us one thing, but then science has now discovered something which is absolute opposition to what the Quran is saying. It's as if it's a dichotomy in itself. Well, it's not. You see, many a times we think that there is an opposition between what science says and what Islam says because of our lack of understanding. Today you find that there are Muslim researchers who have excessively researched with regards to evolution. They say that there is a lot in evolution, the concept of evolution, that Islam accepts. Just in a small few minority aspects, Islam doesn't accept. But that's a separate discussion in itself. If you look at science as it is, within the fields of academia, you find that there are at least 10 or more different models of evolution. Darwinism is just one of these models, yet it is the loudest of these models. Amongst the senior academics within, for example, Oxford and Cambridge, there's a constant debate, it's a contentious issue. There are many who devalue this concept of Darwinism. They prefer other models more so than Darwinist model of evolution. So there's a deep argument and debate even amongst the specialists in this area. It's not conclusive in any way whatsoever. When you look at, for example, the Big Bang Theory, 20 years ago, this was something quite big within our communities. For some, it shook the foundations of the faith. Again, our inability to reconcile what Islam says with regards to this particular theory, you found that many people were shaky in their faiths. You just have to research a little bit. You don't have to be a master in the field. Just research a little bit, understand what type of questions need to be asked, and it could strengthen one's faith. There are 17 models with regards to the Big Bang Theory. How the Big Bang occurred. 17 models. Yes, we've probably heard of one particular model specifically, but there are 17 amongst the academics in this field. When you turn towards the golden age of Islam, this was a very interesting period where the Muslim civilization was significant in the world. You know, when the Prophet came and introduced Islam to the people, they say 500 years later, it brought forth what is known as the golden age of Islam. For a good 500 years, Islam was the leading language, or Arabic was the leading language in academia. The revolution of the Prophet triggered a very powerful movement that the world had never seen before. Yes, the golden age of Islam, when Islam flourished. You found many of the scholars who were nurtured within this particular era, they were considered to be leading scientists. They are the ones who laid the foundations of medicine, who laid the foundations of astronomy, astrology, and all of the different things that we today have taken for granted. It's all come from Muslims. Algebra, it was established by a Muslim. Yes? Science in itself was built and developed by Muslims. When they began to uncover the secrets of existences, they realized the power and the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What it did was it increased their iman. Never did they replace God with science. So it's the attitude. So from this perspective, you realize that when it comes to an intellectual doubt, there are always answers available. A person just needs to sit with an open mind, unbiased, and understand where Islam stands and where exactly modern science stands. Is there a possibility for reconciliation or no? Majority of the time, there is a possibility. You know, Bertrand Russell, the famous British philosopher in the UK, Bertrand Russell, in 1948, he had a public debate with a priest. And during the course of this debate, he started making certain claims. And the claim was, he said that the universe is absolute. The universe is absolute, meaning what? The universe is pre-eternal. It has always existed. It didn't come into existence. This was the opinion that he had. He was a famous atheist. A few years later, now people, of course, they were questioning, well, Christianity says that the universe is created, just like how Islam claims that the universe was created. But then you have a great intelligent philosopher, a very intellectual philosopher telling us that it's always existed based on the science that existed in his time. Later, in the coming years, it was falsified that the universe has never existed pre-eternally. The universe did come into an existence. The Big Bang Theory proved this, yes, that there was a point when the universe was initialized. So again, the idea that science always has the capacity to change what they present to us today is not engraved in gold, that it can't be changed anymore. Beyond this, there's a recognition. The Greek philosophers were very much aware of this. You have the idea of what is known as the sophists, the Montebankers. The sophists were those who claimed themselves to be scholars. They wore the garment of scholars, but they only cared about winning. So they would constantly debate, and this was their area of speciality. They would go and debate, and they were very powerful orators. So Plato, for example, Aristotle, when he speaks to their students, when they speak to their students, they say, be wary of the sophists. Do not listen to them. Don't even sit with them, because through their words, they'll be able to convince you. They disguise themselves as intellectuals, as scholars, but they will misguide you. Do not sit with them. These are the words of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and so on and so forth. The sophists, they only cared about winning arguments, so they would constantly debate with the people. Today we have the same. In fact, civilizations throughout have seen people come forward and disguise themselves as scholars. But you and I as laymen, we don't recognize the level of their ilm. Because they speak good, because they're very, very eloquent, we consider what they say to be true. Only what is required is for us to sit back, take their arguments, expand it, see where exactly or how exactly they formulate their arguments, and by doing so, you will understand where exactly they've gotten wrong, or what arguments they've actually gotten wrong, and how they're fallaciously now presenting it to the people. Now, not all of us have this ability, so there is a need to refer to the ulama. The ulama, when they look at all of the arguments that are presented with regards to atheism, they can dissect it in a very beautiful way and say, this point that they've made, it doesn't match. And hence, the conclusion that they're coming towards doesn't make sense. The issue today in the Muslim world, and I'm not talking about the Shi'i world, the Sunnis have a lot of issues within this particular area, and we have our issues as well. You have what is known as the new scholars, yes, the new age of scholarship, where certain ideas, certain concepts, certain ahkam are changed. So when we look at the changes of these ahkam, which tend to make our lives very, very easy, we are more affiliated, or we choose to be affiliated with them. You've got this person who has presented, by the way, this is a big issue within the Sunni world, trust me. So they present an argument, they change laws based on the standards of society. So when they change laws based on the standards of society, you see that because Islam is now providing a very easy path of how to live in Western secular societies, a lot of people tend to follow such individuals. But then when understanding that this new scholars are now presenting new ideas which are changing the mainstream idea, we turn towards the mainstream scholars and we start asking questions. Why are they so stubborn? Why are they so unwilling to change? I'm sure many of you have heard these arguments before, yes? The Marja, he doesn't live in Florida. He doesn't know the problems that I'm going through. The Marja, he doesn't live in the UK. He doesn't know how people live in the West. The assumption by asking such a question is that Islamic law or the Sharia changes depending on where you live. Not necessarily. The religion of Islam, the message of Rasulullah is for all human beings. It's as if Islam is presenting an Islamic culture that everyone comes under. Not that Islam and the Sharia changes depending on where you live. That's an assumption that we've made. As we've mentioned in the previous night, Islam has its own system. Secular society has its own system. And sometimes we want to force the two to meet somewhere, but it will never meet because these are two very simple, separate systems. The second, social doubts. Do not undermine the fact that we as social humans, as social beings, are influenced by the environment that we're in. There was a study that was done, a research, an experiment that was done in Stanford University. It's very famous in the 1970s sometime, where it's known as the study of the prisoners and the guards. 24 participants were chosen from colleges, different colleges. They were brought towards, it was all a simulation, by the way. So these 24 college students were separated into two. You had 12 guards and 12 prisoners. They were in a simulated prison. The guards, and it was very, very real. So these prisoners, they were arrested in public. They were taken to the police station. Fingerprints were taken, mugshots were taken, and so on and so forth, and they were placed in prisons. The experiment itself lasted for 12 days. 6 days, in fact. 6 days. The experiment lasted 6 days because they had to stop it. They realized that because of the social environment that they were placed in, because the authority was given to the guards began to use their power abusively. And the prisoners, they felt victimized by the guards, meaning that the guards took their roles very, very seriously and the prisoners took their roles very, very seriously. It was all simulated. None of it was real. They say on the second day, one of the prisoners was abused to such an extent that he was demanding a lawyer. Yes, it was simulated. It was all fake. But the impact it had on their psychology was that they thought all of it was real. There was another study that was done. They got a bunch of, again, Stanford University, they got a bunch of participants. All of the participants were actors except for one participant. He was genuine. He genuinely thought he was part of the experiment. So they placed 3 lines on the wall, A, B, and C. The shortest line was C. So the leader of the research of the experiment turned to the first participant, who was an actor, and he asked him, he said, which of these 3 lines is the shortest line? Now the shortest line was C. So which line is the shortest? So the participant said A. Then the second person, it said A. The third person said, it's A. All of them said A is the shortest line, when in fact it was C. When they came to the genuine participant, they asked him which line is the shortest. He said it's A. People are influenced by the opinions that others have, and it affects us. It changes our understanding of what's real and what's not. So, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So when you realize that doubts can sometimes emanate from the opinions that people have, and nowadays a lot of people have the right to their own opinions. On Twitter, if you spend an hour on Twitter, you'd recognize how many people have their own opinions. You'll have a PhD who will post a tweet based on his research that he's conducted for the past 10 years, but then you'll have a layman on Twitter debunk him, for example, by presenting his own ideas. It's like sometimes we have to realize what our level is and what the levels of the ulama, and sometimes the professionals are in their own respected fields. The opinions of others can have an effect on us when it comes to our approach to reality. Then you have the third type of doubt, which is known as spiritual doubts. I feel disconnected from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know, there's that idea, I feel disconnected from Allah. It's as if Allah has abandoned me. When you read the Quran tells you that La taqnutu min rahmatillah. Do not lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this thought always comes to our minds, especially when we commit sins. You know, the nature of committing sins is that there is a great deal of regret and remorse that comes after. And this is when you feel it. That Allah, He doesn't look towards me. He's abandoned me. He doesn't shower His mercy upon me. Because the doubt in itself is of a spiritual nature, the solution or the response has to be of a spiritual nature. This is when the ulama say that whenever you feel disconnected with Allah, do as much as you can to connect with Him. Engage in adhkar. Engage in dhikr. Don't undermine the powerful adhkar that are there within our sources. Repeating adhkar is also phenomenal. You know, by repeating 100 times, 150 times, 200 times a particular statement like Subhanallah, for example, what you're doing is you're now helping your mind rewire. You're tapping into the unconscious or the subconscious part of the mind. You're now training it, you're rewiring it so that it becomes embedded with the institution of Tawheed, with the principles of Tawheed. That has an effect on your life, more than you would be aware of. To engage in salah. You know, we have this idea, it's time for salah, but you know, I've been working all day, I'm sweating, let me go shower and then I'll pray salah. I'm hungry, let me eat and I'll pray salah. I'm tired, let me go rest for a bit and then engage in my salah. We have this idea. If I was to engage in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through salah or with Allah through salah and I'm tired and I'm hungry and I'm, dirty, maybe that salah is not accepted. I'm standing before the King of Kings. At least I should be clean. Ayatollah Bahjat has a very beautiful, profound statement here. He says that the fundamental time, the priority should be awwal al-waqt. When you do so, there are certain benefits that you acquire. All of these different things, these are just excuses for you to delay it. He then goes on to say, he says that our teacher, Ayatollah Ali al-Qadhi, Sayyid Ali al-Qadhi, who was a famous, one of the greatest urafa of the previous generation, he says, he quotes his teacher, he says that those who pray on time, I guarantee you, you will see success come towards you in your life. Things will eventually work out for you. And then he makes a profound statement. He says, if things don't work out for you and you see your life to be worse off by praying on time, then you can actively give la'an on me. With such confidence he says this. Then, for example, you should engage in the Quran. You know, they say beautifully that when we engage in all of these different ways to reconnect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there has to be the intention to change. If there is a doubt of a spiritual nature, have the intention within you to overpower and overwhelm this doubt. Otherwise, engaging and reconnecting with Allah will not make a difference at all. They say one day Amir al-Mu'mineen and Kumail ibn Ziyad al-Nakha'i were walking in Kufa. They came across a house. The occupant of the house, he was reciting the Quran and his voice was beautiful. So Kumail stops. He stops to listen to this person reciting the Quran. The Imam tells him, Kumail, let's go. We have to go, let's go. This is Amir al-Mu'minin, just a few moments. Such a beautiful voice, I have to listen a bit more. So the Imam waits for him. And then Kumail, when he's ready, they then proceed. He says, Ya Kumail, I'll remind you one day of this day. When the time comes, I'll remind you. He says, why, what happened? He says, don't worry, when the time comes, I'll remind you of what happened just now. In the battle of Naharwan. In the battle of Naharwan, Amir al-Mu'minin is walking in the battlefield. He sees a corpse, a mayyit. He says, Kumail, come. Kumail comes to him. He says, do you know who this person is? He was one of the Khawarij. He says, you know who this person is? He says, no, I don't. He says, this was the person who was reciting the Quran beautifully in his house. Remember that day when we were walking in the night of Kufa, in the streets of Kufa? Engaging in Quran, you would think that this person is engaging in the dhikr of Allah, so his connection with Allah will be fortified. Well, engaging with Allah doesn't mean that your connection with Allah will be solid. Depends on the intention. Yes, have the intention, have the niyyah to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then you have, for example, a doubt which is based on one's arrogance. We have to know that this life, or the world that we're living in, it is impossible for us to know everything. Epistemically, we are restricted, and we have to come to terms with that. Many a times we know what the answers are, yet we want other answers, for example. Yes? Very interestingly, I remember having a discussion with one of the brothers in the UK regarding one of the hot topics of this day and age, of tawassul. We sat down for an hour and a half. Something I said that tawassul, one of the very interesting aspects and concept of tawassul is that it has always existed. From the time of the death of the Holy Prophet until 600 years or 700 years, it has always existed. And it's a phenomenon that has existed amongst both the Shia and the Sunnah. When you refer to Tafsir al-Razi, for example, in his tafsir, he speaks about tawassul and the validity of tawassul. At-Tabrasi, At-Tusi, Shaykh al-Saduq, all of them believe in it. It was part and parcel of the Muslim Islamic culture. Imam Shafi', one of the imams of the four schools of thought, he says that when you go to the city of Medina, seek the shafa'ah of the Holy Prophet, and so on and so forth. So I said this to him. I said, look, since the time of the Prophet's death until 600 years later, when Ibn Taymiyyah came up, it was he was the first one who publicly denounces the act of tawassul. So I said to him, does that mean that all of the scholars were wrong? That each and every single one of them for at least 6 to 7 centuries were all wrong in their beliefs? He says, yeah, they were all wrong. See, that level of arrogance, intellectual arrogance, there's a need for us to have humility. It's impossible for us to know every single thing. But then this is where we need to trust the ulama. Islam is a religion that is based on trust, not mistrust. When there are people who are more superior than us, much more knowledgeable than us, who have written voluminous concepts and ideas in their books, their way their mind thinks is very, very different to the way our mentalities are, the way we think. There has to be a level of trusting their knowledge and their research. When you look at, for example, Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, profound personality. They say he was an Uthmani. He was very much influenced by his tribe and his party. He was an avid supporter of Uthman ibn Affan. One of the stations just before Karbala, he pitches his tent, he's with his wife. Abi Abdullah alayhi salam pitches his tent and he's with his family and companions. The Imam recognizes that Zuhair is in the same compound, so he sends a messenger. The messenger goes to Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. Ya Zuhair, Abu Abdullah alayhi salam summons you. He says, I'm not interested. He did not want to meet with the Imam alayhi salam. His wife convinces him, go. His wife was a Shia lover of the Ahlul-bayt. The truth is calling you. The divine appointee of Allah is calling you. Go towards him. So out of hesitancy, he goes to the Imam alayhi salam. The narration says that he sits with the Imam for a few minutes. In a single sitting, he returns to his wife. He tells his wife, listen, go back to the city of Kufa. I'm divorcing you. I'm joining the camp of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. His wife denies, the narration said that his wife was also part of the camp of the women in Karbala. So his wife joins him. They both joined the camp of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. What we have in our hands to be the followers of the Ahlul-bayt alayhim as-salam, this is a treasure that none can compare to. And we should make the most of it, not abuse it and squander it. You look at Aliyun al-Akbar. Oh Father, are we not on haqq? On the 10th of Muharram, you look at the valiant nature of Aliyun al-Akbar. This is the beauty of the companions, but much more so with regards to the Bani Hashim and the sons of the Bani Hashim. How young they were and how they were very much willing to give their own lives, the greatest asset they had in their hands for the way or for the sake of the perseverance of preservation of the religion of Islam. Without any hesitancy, he comes towards the Imam alayhi salam in the morning of the 10th. The companions have now given their lives. Now it was time for the Bani Hashim. They say Ali al-Akbar approaches Abu Abdullah alayhi salam. He approaches his father, he seeks permission. Many of the companions, they sought permission from the Imam alayhi salam, but the Imam only refused for the children. The majority of them, they would out of respect ask permission and the Imam would let them go. When Ali al-Akbar asks permission, the Imam tells him, go. He doesn't even deny the request. He says, my son, go. It's now your turn. So he prepares for battle. When he enters the battlefield, as he's approaching the battlefield, they say, Abu Abdullah, he raises his hands towards the skies, he points towards the skies, he says, Ya Allah, bear witness that I am sending you my son. He says, indeed, this is the person who is غلام أشبه الناس أشبه الناس خلقا وخلقا ومنطقا برسولك نبي المصطفى المحمد. He says, this is my son who best represents the Prophet in terms of the words that he speaks, in terms of his voice, in terms of his looks, in terms of the way he carries his way, the way he carries himself. He says, Ya Allah, whenever we miss the presence of Rasulullah, we would look towards Ali al-Akbar. He says, Ya Allah, with regards to my enemies, deprive the blessings of the earth for them, disunite them, may their governors turn against them. These are the ones who invited us and promised to aid us, but now they are standing against us, killing us one after the other. Ali al-Akbar then enters the battlefield. He says, Ana Ali ibn al-Hussein ibn Ali, Nahnu wa bayt Allah, awla bin Nabi, Wallahi la yahkum fina ibn al-Da'i, أتعنكم بالروم حتى ينثني أضربكم بالسيف حتى يلتوي ضرب غلام هاشمي علوي. He says, I am Ali, the son of Hussein, the son of Ali. We are closer to Rasulullah than anyone. He says, Ibn Ziyad has no authority over us. He cannot rule over us. I will stab you with my spear until my spear breaks. I will strike you with my sword until my sword is bent. I will strike you the strike of a Hashimi, a Alawi youth. Then they say Ali al-Akbar engages in battle. He kills 120 from the enemies. They say Abu Abdullah alayhi salam was standing at the door of the tent. Layla was sitting inside. She would look towards Abu Abdullah. She would observe his expressions. All of a sudden, they say, as she was looking towards Abu Abdullah, the color of his face changed. It became yellow. He was in the state of anxiousness. So she tells him, Ya Abu Abdullah, tell me, has something happened to my son? He replies, Ya Layla, nothing has happened. But a man, Bakr has approached Ali al-Akbar, and I fear that he will strike Ali al-Akbar. Ali is tired, but he will strike Ali, I don't know. Then all of a sudden, his face, he turns to Layla, he says, Ya Layla, the du'as of a mother is always considered to be mustajab. If you wish to see Ali, then engage in dua. She raises her hands, she says, Ya Allah, you are the one who returned Yusuf to Yaqub. Return my Ali to me so I can see him one last time. Ali kills Bakr. Then he returns to Abu Abdullah. When he returns to his father, he says, Ya Abata, al-atash qad qatalani wa thiklu al-hadid qad ajhadani. He says, my father, the thirst is killing me and the heaviness of this iron has tired me. Is there any water that you may have that I can drink? Then Abu Abdullah replies, he says, oh my son, it breaks the heart of your father that you call out to him but he cannot help, that you seek aid from him but he cannot aid you. He says, oh my son, go to your mother, she has become unconscious, go meet her and then return to the battlefield. Ali al-Akbar enters the tent, he sees his mother unconscious, he sits alongside Layla, he takes her head, places it on his chest, she wakes up, she says, is this my son Akbar? Ali responds, it's me mother. They embrace one final time, then Ali al-Akbar returns to the battlefield, he kills 200 more. Then Hamid ibn Muslim narrates, he says, a man by the name of Murra ibn Munkad, Murra ibn Munkad, he came forth and he said, Wallah, I will strike this youth, I will strike him in such a way it will break the heart of his father. Then he says, Wallahi, if I do not, may the sins of the Arabs be burdened on my shoulders. He came from behind Ali and stabbed him with a spear, then struck him on the head. They say Ali leaned forward towards his horse, the neck of his horse. The blood that began to flow blinded the horse. Instead of the horse going back to Abu Abdullah, it went towards the enemy lines. When he entered the enemy lines, they began to strike him from all directions. فَقَتَّأُوهُ إِرْبًا إِرْبًا. They began to tear his body apart. Then he calls out, Ya Abba, Ya Abata, Assalamu alayka, Ya Abu Abdullah. They say, Abu Abdullah, he mounts his horse and he hastens towards Ali al-Akbar. Some narrations say that when he began moving, Sukaina calls out, Ya Abata, where are you going? He says, I am going to Ali. She says, why are you going in that direction when my brother is in this direction? Why do you go in the wrong direction? Abu Abdullah responds, oh my daughter, do not blame me. The grief of Akbar has blinded me. Then he hastens towards Ali al-Akbar. As he approaches near, he's calling out, Waladi Ali, Waladi Ali, my son Ali, my son Ali. As he approaches Ali al-Akbar, he jumps off his horse, he throws himself alongside Ali al-Akbar, he takes his head, he cleans off the blood, he places it on his lap. Then he says, may Allah curse your killers, my son. But there was something strange. Abu Abdullah noticed that Ali al-Akbar is happy, but at the same time is sad. Two emotions. So he asks his son, he says, my son, why are you happy and why are you sad? He says, my father, I can see the gates of heaven open. The angels, amongst them Rasulullah, has descended, in his hands a cup of water. He is telling me to come towards him, but when I look towards the other direction, I see Bibi. She is looking at my wounds. Now my father, she looks towards you. Now she is striking her face. Wa Husseina, Wa Husseina. Then all of a sudden Ali al-Akbar stops moving and his voice becomes quiet. Abu Abdullah alayhi salam carries the body back towards the tents. As he approaches the tents, Hamid ibn Muslim narrates, a woman came out rushing from the tents. She began calling, "Oh my nephew, oh my nephew, Akbar, oh apple of my heart, oh light of my eyes." Then she threw herself on top of Ali al-Akbar and began wailing and screaming. He asked, "So who is this woman?" They said to him, "This is Zainab bint Ali alayhi salam." They say Abu Abdullah had to take the hands of Zainab slowly and escort her towards the tents. As he entered the tents, Sukaina came towards Abu Abdullah. "Ya Abata, tell me what's happened to my brother." As she was leaving the tent, Abu Abdullah stops her. "Oh my daughter, have patience, be steadfast." She replies, "My father, tell me, how can I be patient when they have killed my brother?" إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون.
इसके सीने से लेके